You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
I would like to recognize our sponsors from tonight. The Iowa Native Plant Society, HBK Engineering, Project Green, Adams and Baubach Associates, the City of Coralville, Earthview Environmental, Friends of Hickory Hill Park, Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, Legacy Green Builders, and Lon and Barbara Drake. If we could give a round of applause to those that have helped. I also would like to recognize the Four Seasons Garden Club for their always annually amazing refreshments. I'd also like to recognize our board members. If our board members could all please stand up. Broke Land Trust board members, if you're here, go ahead and stand up. And there's all of you standing on the sides. And then I'd like to recognize our staff who has made this evening possible. Tammy Wright. Tammy Wright is somewhere here. I don't see her. And then Susan Spears, our assistant. And there's Susan. She and Tammy made this evening possible. And then our property land steward, Seth Somerville, is in the back also. Hopefully you maybe had a chance to talk with him as well. Okay, I think I did everything I was supposed to do. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Dick Baker, who is a longtime supporter and friend of our organization. He is going to be announcing our speaker.
Thank you, Liz. I was actually thinking about giving up doing this, and then I found out who the speaker was, and no way. We've been friends for decades. We have very similar interests, the natural environment, the biota, the things that live there. We each own and care for our property, that trying to promote and continue natural habitats. We're both concerned about global climate change, and then there's just the joy of nature, which we have a great deal of. Now, Connie has written 9 books, I guess, but her most recent one just came out March 1st and is, I think many of you have it already, is available here. And I guess one of the things that was very pleasing to me was it was reviewed by one of the giants in environmental science in the world. Bill McKibben read this book and said, "This book is great, you should read it." It was a very strong endorsement. So with no further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Connie Mutel.
So, I'm told I have to stand right next to the mic. If I step away from it and you can't hear me, please just wave like this. And I will say that people often say, well, there has to be something good about climate change. And I kind of say, well, I'm not too sure. But maybe one of the good things is that climate change is an equalizer. And I feel very equalized with all of you tonight, because as of an hour ago, I didn't have a PowerPoint that worked. And my husband And son and daughter-in-law all helped me get it up working, and I'm hoping it works. Some of the spacing might be off a little bit. But in any case, it's a joy to be here with you today. Many of you are my friends. Before I start, what I would like to say is that I'm dedicating this talk to the Reverend Barbara Schlachter, who was a woman that many of us in this room admired. She's a person who gave much to us as people, much to all of those that she loved, and much to the earth. And we will miss her greatly. She died just very recently. I'd like to also say thanks to my home institutions, IHR Hydroscience and Engineering at the University of Iowa, and the Global Change Center, which gave a very generous grant so that this book is quite inexpensive, and I thank them sincerely for that. Also, the University of Iowa Press, the personnel there have put so much energy and passion into their work, and I think it shows in the quality of the product, and also the Borough Land Trust. And I'd like to thank the legislators who are here too, or legislative staff. I know that someone from Grassley's staff is here, and Senator Rob Hogan. Do we have any other state or county or federal legislators here tonight? Sally, is Sally Stutzman here? Welcome, Sally. Rod Sullivan, welcome, Rob. So thank you to everyone who came, and thanks to you legislators for anything that you have done to help us deal with the climate change crisis. I know Rob Hogue has even written a book about this himself. We actually worked with the same editor, so that's for the good of both of us, I think. And I know Senator Grassley's been very concerned about supporting biofuels and the like, so thanks to you for that. So it's a pleasure to talk to this group. I think this is the third time that I've introduced a book of mine at Prairie Preview. And every time I do it, I feel very privileged because I'm talking to people that I really love. I probably know, at least casually, maybe a third of you, a quarter, a third, maybe a half of you in this room. And you're all people who, as Dick Baker said, people who love the natural world, have a passion for the natural world, understand why it's important to keep nature, to keep native species, to keep ecosystem services healthy so that we have an integrated, functioning natural world that supports human life and everything else. So you guys get this stuff. You understand why it's not a good idea to start tinkering and pulling species out and pulling processes apart, which is what's happening now with climate change. I remember exactly 8 years ago, I stood up here and introduced Emerald Horizon, which was a book about the integrity of nature in Iowa and how that was transformed to how Iowa was converted to an agricultural landscape. And in that book, at that time, I said, we are probably one of the things that we've done is destroy this wonderful root, these masses of roots, and we're probably going to have more floods because of this. But I don't think anybody was ready for the tremendous floods that struck 3 months after Emerald Horizon was published. Cedar Rapids, the water rose to twice the level that it had ever in the past. The flooding in eastern Iowa at that time was the third most expensive flooding in the history of our nation. It was really a major event. And at that time, I started to look around and see other things that were happening in our world, things that were a little bit upsetting. My husband and I live in a woods. Many of you know this, a woods that we're restoring. And oftentimes that woods now is filled with moisture, filled with fog in the morning. It's not nice and crisp and clean the way it used to be. The rains that we have come down not in inches, but sometimes in feet in this country, and they're much heavier and much more concentrated in the early spring. On our land, we've had 7 inches of rainfall in a few hours, rainfall that has completely disturbed the hydrology of the land and that we have not so far been able to cope with. We see out on Sugar Bottom Road now in the late summer, we see the ponds turning bright green in late August. This is because of algal blooms. Because of the heat, the water is much hotter than it normally is. I have so many friends who complain about their allergies and asthma. Have you noticed this? A lot more than in the past. And then even this past December, do you remember past December? I tend to forget weather very quickly. But in December, just a few months ago, we had warmth that was 30 degrees. Temperatures were 30 degrees above the average for the month. Record highs and record divergence from the average average temperatures. And we had so much rainfall that the Mississippi had record flooding. The meteorologists were calling this flooding insane because you don't have flooding in the Mississippi in December. You have snow, not rain. And that same month in our woods, I not only heard chorus frogs singing their mating songs, but found violets in bloom. All of these are signs of changing patterns in the world. Changes that we can attribute, at least in part, not wholly, but at least in part, to the warming of our world, the gradually rising temperature, which is called climate change. And I've written this book to address that problem, climate change, but I didn't want to write another book about science, the science of climate change. We have enough of those books, and quite honestly, people don't want to read them. People are turned off by climate change, and I don't blame them. So what I thought about doing, and I thought about this for years before beginning, was I wanted to tell stories about climate change. I wanted to tell stories about our woods, the woods where I lived, the woods that I love with a passion. I told stories in this book about my own life and my own trying to cope with health problems intermittently, because loss of a person's health is very similar to the loss of the planet's health, which is what's happening now. And I wanted to do this in a manner that would not only teach people the science of climate change, because the science of climate change is in the book, but would entertain them, and it would grab them in the heart, in the gut, as well as hopefully teach them something. And this book focuses quite a bit on this little girl. This is our Ellie Mutel. It's our 3-year-old granddaughter. And she's kind of emblematic of all of the people to come, the people who will have to live with the climate that we're creating right now. So Ellie is discussed a lot in this book, and she's also discussed in this talk a little bit. So tonight I can't tell you the story completely of climate change. Climate change is a huge, complex topic. I continue to learn about it. I continue to find things that I don't understand. You will too. I don't think anybody totally understands climate change, but what I'm going to do is give you a quick run through some of the things that I learned and hope that this will help you to try to put things into a cohesive picture. Okay, taking a long view of climate change, people often say, well, we don't need to worry about climate change because the climate is always changing. And if somebody says that to me, I say, you are exactly right. The Earth's climate has changed throughout the history, the 4.3 or 4, whatever it is, billion years of the Earth. Climate is constantly changing. For example, 56 million years ago, we had what was called the hothouse world, with temperatures that were 9 to 15 degrees hotter on average. The oceans were 660 feet approximately higher. The thing is, you don't see any people in that picture. This wasn't a hot climate that affected people. You did have at that time crocodiles and leafy plants up at the poles of the Earth, but no people anywhere. We did have people 20,000 years ago when the climate was quite a bit cooler. At that time, the sea level was over 300 feet lower than now, and because of that, the water was all captured by the glaciers. People could migrate from Siberia over to what we now call Alaska and come into North America. And at that time, there were maybe a few million people on the earth. This happened 15 to 20,000 years ago. But these people were not living in suburbs and driving around in cars. They led a very different lifestyle than what we have now. So that neither of these examples or any other examples consider the fact that what we're not talking about is necessarily the survival of the planet, because the planet's going to survive with climate change. And maybe humans will survive as well. But we're talking about something that's very different, something that developed in the last 10,000 years, which we call civilization. And if you look at this graph, you'll see that 20,000 years ago, when the people came across Beringia, we had the end of the Ice Age, and the temperature was fluctuating quite a bit, but it was quite a bit colder than now. And then the temperature raised up to the zero line on this, that's a baseline in the graph. And for the next 10,000 years, we had a remarkably stable climate that didn't vary much more than 1 degree centigrade, that's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, in any direction for the last 10,000 years. We also had sea levels that were pretty stable for many years. And that, because of that stability, we could develop all of the things that we now consider human. When we think about humanity, we think about perhaps the villages that we live in, the large cities, the transportation systems that connect them. We think about written word, the development of libraries, the development of formal religion, and sophisticated musical groups like orchestras. We think about the development of food systems, modern agriculture, and transportation of that food to places where we can eat it, complicated, complex political and economic systems, and we think about the population increasing from that few million people that was around 20,000, 10,000 years ago to about 7.4 billion people today. Much different world that we're living in, and all of these have developed in the last 10,000 years when the climate was very stable. So if we go back to this graph again, we can see that just in recent years, in fact, actually just about since the time our children entered this world and started to grow up around 1980, we've increased the global average temperature, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit, so that it is rising up above this kind of blue safe zone that we've held for the last 10,000 years. This graph shows here the time span from 20,000 to 10,000 years ago to now, and to the prediction 100 years from now. And that prediction is that our temperature will go from about 1 degree centigrade, where we are now, just about, above a long-term global average, to about 4 degrees centigrade, that's 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit above that global average. And you might think that this is not a very big difference in temperature, but it's actually quite a big thing, because even with a very small temperature increase of about 1 degree, we've had profound changes in the weather systems and in the thermal forcing of the atmosphere. So when people look at this graph, they say, well, why are we having temperature increases now? And scientists have looked at this. They've looked at things like solar fluxes and solar activity, the tilt of the Earth, what is the Earth doing in terms of its rotation around the sun. They looked at natural variation, and none of those things could explain the amount and the speed of temperature increase that we're now seeing. The only thing that can is the increase in carbon dioxide levels over the last few years, actually over the last few decades. You will see that in addition to a stable temperature for the last 10,000 years, we had a stable carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. It fluctuated between around 180 parts per million, 280 parts per million. For the last 10,000 years, it was closer to 280 parts per million. But just recently, it has shot up almost perpendicularly, and we are now at 400 parts per million. That is a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we've had for the last 800,000 years to 3 million years. So this is truly an unusual event. This is what's called the greenhouse effect. It's what causes something called global warming or climate change. And the explanation is actually quite simple. When the sunlight comes in, it comes in as light energy, as light, and it is absorbed by the Earth and re-radiated up again as infrared radiation. That's radiation with a longer wavelength. And that energy is then absorbed by carbon dioxide and by other greenhouse gas molecules and re-radiated back to the Earth, so that the heat from the Earth comes back multiple times instead of going up once and escaping into the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide thus acts as a blanket in the atmosphere, and that blanket is getting denser and it's getting thicker because we keep putting up more and more carbon dioxide. So here's a little family story about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Each of these blobs is 5 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And for many years, well, throughout at least the last 10,000 years, for about the last several 100,000 years, we've had temperatures of the Earth average around 57 degrees Fahrenheit, 57, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was because of this relatively thin carbon dioxide blanket we had. We had enough carbon dioxide to keep the Earth warm, but not too hot. That started to change with the Industrial Revolution, which started in around 1750, about 50 years ago. And at that time, we started to exchange energy that came mostly from animals or from human muscles by the burning of fossil fuels. These are fuels that were formulated that pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere millions of years ago. We started digging up those fossil fuels and burning them up, and that reintroduced masses of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere starting in 1750. This is my great-grandfather. He came over from Germany around 1850. By the time he came here, we had increased the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere just a tiny bit. But it's interesting, by that time, scientists already had figured out that the gases in the atmosphere determined the temperature of the Earth, A, and that B, if you increase the concentration of some of these gases, you're going to get the atmosphere heating up. So this isn't new science. This is couple hundreds of years old. Here are my parents. They were born around 1910. By the time they were born, a Swedish scientist had already figured out how much the temperature would rise if we doubled the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So people were already, and he did this pretty accurately, people were already starting to get the idea of carbon dioxide goes up, temperature goes up, here's how much it's going to go up. My parents were born at the time that horses were giving way to automobiles, and candles and gas lamps and the like were giving way to electricity. But still, by the time they were born, we had only increased carbon dioxide concentration by about 15 parts per million. By the time I came on the scene, a little bit after World War II, we were getting ready for a tremendous transformation in the Earth and the way it functioned. Because after World War II, we were getting primed up. People were moving to the suburbs. Roads were being developed. Everybody had a car, then 2 cars, then maybe 3 cars in the driveway. Consumption went way up. Population went way up with the baby boom. And all of these things happened fairly rapidly after World War II. Still, the concentration of carbon dioxide just went up maybe 10 parts per million, not that much. That wasn't the case by the time our sons were born. These 3 cute little boys entered the family around 1980. And by the time they came along, we had increased carbon dioxide concentration by about 30 parts per million. And the important thing is that 1980 was the time that both carbon dioxide concentration and temperature started to go up very steeply in this planet. A few more important things happened in that decade of the 1980s. One is in about, I think it was 1985, we hit the level of 350 parts per million carbon dioxide, which people have often felt was the maximum safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The other thing is you'll notice that very tiny little dot along the bottom of the time axis. That was the first politicization in this country of what was called at that time global warming. What happened is that there was serious discussion in the legislature in Washington about having some kind of carbon pricing scheme, some sort of carbon tax that would put a price on carbon so that consumption would be decreased and people would be forced or encouraged to look for other alternatives other than burning fossil fuels. And what happened is as soon as that was proposed, a group of oil companies got together and started to lobby very strongly in Washington to disband this proposal, and did that successfully. So politicization started a few decades ago. By the time little Ellie came along in 2012, we had gone up, 55 parts per million. By 2012, we knew that we had a problem. People were talking openly about climate change. 2012, we were starting to see pretty strong reactions to what was happening with this increase in carbon dioxide and increase in temperature. And if Ellie lives to be an elderly woman, which I hope she will, and in good health, we will approximately double the carbon dioxide concentration. At least that's if everything goes as it's going now. If we follow current trajectories, we'll go from about 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide, where we are now, to 800 parts per million. Now remember, 400 parts per million we haven't seen for over 800,000 years. So this would take us to a place that is profoundly different from any climate in any world that we now know. So let's talk about some of these elements of global warming. The Earth's temperatures are rising rapidly. We know that not just from taking the temperature on our deck or whatever, but from thousands of temperatures that are gathered consistently both on the land and on the water and on these, in the atmosphere. And those temperatures are put together to form maps like this. You can find these regularly if you look at NASA or NOAA maps on the web. And what people do is they take a global average temperature. I think this one is the temperature from 1981 to about 2010. That's the base period. And then they will compare, say, a year's temperatures to that base. And usually the globe looks red, which means that the temperatures have gone to a hotter temperature than in the past. The blue areas are places where the temperature is a little bit lower. But in recent years, the red temperatures have dominated. And you can also use those temperatures to figure out what's called the global average temperature. And when we say the temperature is increased by a degree or it's going to increase by 4 degrees, this is what we're talking about. That means you take all of these temperatures from the pole to the equator, night and day around the year, and you average them out, and you get just a small number. As I said, it's less than 1 degree centigrade, a little bit less than 1 degree centigrade right now. But that number is actually very profound because it includes a lot of these big red blobs on the map and a smaller number of the blue areas. You can also, other expressions of steady warming, we have a lot of record high temperatures. I'm sure you noticed that. In the news, we're having record high temperatures right now, I believe. A lot more heat waves than we used to in the past. We have a divergence in the number of heat waves compared to cold spells. When I was a child, we had about the same number of heat waves and cold spells. Now we have about 2 heat waves for every 1 cold spell. And each decade is warmer since 1980. We've had 14 of the 15 hottest years on record since the year 2000. The thing that I want to emphasize is just because you have a hot globe, a globe that's warming up, doesn't mean that you don't have cold weather sometimes. And you might remember February of 2014, the polar vortex. Remember the cold winter we've had for actually a couple recent winters. And you can see here what that looked like. This is a map from NASA showing that cold air coming down from the Arctic right across the Midwest and giving us what I considered a very nice, cold, crisp, snowy winter. But the year itself, the year 2014, still was the hottest year on record at that time, because look at the rest of the globe. The global average temperature was still up. It was still higher than the year before because of all those very hot years. So if somebody says, oh, we don't have climate change because it's cold out today, then you have to say, well, that's because you have to think about global average temperatures. Other signs of warming, the steady melting of the ice of the world, and the migration of species. Nature itself is telling us that the temperatures are warming. We have migration of insects, of butterflies, of reptiles and amphibians, of plants, of birds, of mammals, of fish, either to the north and south in the southern hemisphere, or up mountains. And all of these are responses to a small but a significant increase in average temperature. The next thing, though, is that we need to remember that climate change is a lot more than just global warming. Okay, we don't usually use the word global warming anymore because of this. The warmth, if you think about warmer air, when do we have hot, humid weather? Well, you have humid weather when it's hot, because hot air can hold more moisture than cold air, and hot air also increases the evaporation rate. So when you have an increase in atmospheric warmth, you have an increase in atmospheric moisture. And if you increase the warmth, you also have increase in atmospheric turbulence and instability, which means that you have more extreme weather. And if you've paid attention, you've probably realized that the thing that we have a lot more than we had even 10 years ago are extremes of weather, extreme storms, extreme rainfalls, extreme floods, extreme droughts. And this is because of this increase in the Earth's energy. Stronger winds, larger rainstorms, more extreme events are all part of climate change. And indeed, if you think about heavy downpours, one of the very statistically significant maps is this map showing that in the Midwest we've had an increase of 37% increase of heavy downpours. Instead of having those nice gentle rains throughout the growing season, we now have really strong rains early in the spring. And this is a problem because they usually come before the soil is covered with plants, and so they cause a lot of erosion. More rains, extreme storms, the potential for larger and more frequent flooding, shifting to heavy spring rains, and increases in soil erosion and runoff. And the oceans also are changing a lot. I don't tend to think about this a lot because we don't live close to an ocean, but the oceans are changing significantly, warmer, higher, more acidic. The storms, the hurricanes have higher peak winds. They're feeding off of the increase of about 1 degree Fahrenheit in ocean waters right now, so that the storm surges are higher and the flood potential along the shore is higher. The small rise in global average temperatures is already having major effects. You probably know that the Arctic is warming 2 times or more faster than our land down here for several reasons, and people are very concerned about the disappearance of sea ice and all of the things that are happening. For example, the Inuit buildings and villages that are falling into the sea and are threatened because of that. But you may not be aware that Miami Beach regularly gets flooded now, not even by high tides, especially high tides or storm surges, just by normal tides. The streets get filled with water, and this is starting to happen all along the East Coast. These are called nuisance floods, simply because the ocean, on average, is about 8 inches higher than it used to be around the world. You probably know that polar bears are starving, but you may not know that moose in northeastern Minnesota are also having collapsing populations because of two things. One, they get stressed by the warmth, the greater warmth in the summertime, and because they are overburdened with ticks. The ticks are increasing numbers, and moose are dying. Moose that are found dead will have as many as 50 to 70,000 ticks. Those ticks are literally bleeding them to death. And I just heard, just before start coming up here, we have the third neighbor who lives very close to us has an unusually strong case of Lyme disease, we were told, and Lyme disease is also increasing in part because of climate change, not totally. None of these things are clear links, like here, one cause and one effect, but climate change is contributing to these problems. Agriculture in Iowa, some people feel that climate change is going to increase productivity, and indeed, the models show that agricultural productivity may increase till around 2040, 2050. After that, it's supposed to decrease as the temperatures increase. But even now, the agriculture is being plagued by an increase in extreme weather. Livestock and crop productivity with extreme weather is going down. And there's a loss of predictability. Someone said to me once that the biggest thing that we're losing with climate change is predictability. We don't know what is going to happen in the future the way we used to. And of course, erosion, major erosion because of those heavy spring rains. And all of these things are extremely expensive to deal with. Local communities, it's said, are now at times spending billions of dollars recovering from climate change-related disasters. Climate change is also feeding into other world events in ways that people might not realize. For example, the Zika virus, which is a horrible, horrible thing that's spreading. It's being spread by the yellow fever mosquito, which also transmits dengue, which is called breakbone fever because of the intense pain, and yellow fever itself. The mosquito is increasing and spreading because of human transportation. I mean, people are migrating, people are traveling more and spreading the disease and the virus around the world, and because of people growing into overcrowded cities. But the thing is that that mosquito matures much more rapidly and it feeds more frequently at higher temperatures. And the virus itself within the mosquito reproduces more rapidly at higher temperatures. So climate change is contributing to the Zika virus outbreak, as it did to the 2015 Asian influenza outbreak in poultry. I don't know if many of you remember this. How many? Over 30 million poultry in Iowa died from this. The worst was called the worst animal disease outbreak in the history of Iowa. The influenza virus evolved over in China and normally would have stayed there or would have stayed in Asia because birds migrate north and south rather than east and west. But it is thought to have gotten up to the Arctic Circle and then gone across the Bering Strait and down through the states of Washington and Oregon to the Midwest, because the birds that met up in that Bering Strait were no longer separated by temperature differentials. Let me put that a little bit more simply. In the past, the cold temperatures kept bird populations separated. Now, with the Arctic warming, birds are mingling and transmitting diseases to each other, and that's been shown with this Asian influenza as well as with other infectious diseases. So when you start to think about this, you realize after a little bit that climate change affects everything human. It affects when we play outside and when we are actually even able to go outside, the natural disasters that we have to face, the illnesses that we deal with, our military security. The military actually has been concerned about climate change since at least the 1990s, maybe before that. Our the production of food, what we eat and when we eat it, the flooding, the frequency and the size of floods, the infrastructure, the stability of our infrastructure, and the natural systems, again, that support our lives. The very way that we define nature is going to be redefined by climate change, as well as the ecosystem services that the natural world provides, and the distribution of plant and animal species. So you can consider climate change an equal opportunity crisis affecting everyone and everything, and increasingly something that will determine how we live and why we die. If you think about climate change in the future and what's going to happen to Ellie and our other little cute grandkids or kids in our lives, it's not whether, but how much the world is going to change. We're already experiencing climate change. We can't turn it off. It's like we've turned on the faucet, and we might turn down that faucet so it drips a little bit more, but we won't be able to turn it off. But the changes, the thing that's interesting is that the changes depend on current, but also future emissions. If we continue to go the route that we're now going, we will have, in a business as usual scenario, by 2100 we'll have about 4 degrees, as I said before, 4 degrees or 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit average temperatures that are warmer. Sea level will rise another 3 to 4 feet, and we'll have an intensification of all of the droughts, of the floods, of the rains, of the windstorms, of the hurricanes, of all of those with catastrophic results. This is when you get into these really, really depressing doomsday scenarios. Military instability, environmental collapse, shortages of food and water, social collapse. Those are business as usual scenarios. But the thing is, we don't know that we're going to go there because we don't know if we're going to continue to release fossil fuel gases emissions, as we're now doing. There are two other things that are important to remember when we think about the future of climate change. One is that you can't turn climate change off. Even if we stopped emitting gases today, we would still have an increase of about 0.5 degree centigrade. And that's because of the carbon dioxide that's up in the atmosphere that would continue to warm the globe. And also, about 1/4 of the human-released carbon dioxide is going to be there 1,000 years from now. It's not like once you break it down, you're going to get rid of it. So we'll continue to raise temperatures way after we stop releasing gases. And also the oceans. The oceans have soaked up about over 90%, something like 93% of the heat that we've released into the atmosphere already. So that once that heat starts coming out of the oceans, once that the oceans try to equilibrize with the atmosphere, the temperatures will continue to rise. So that for all human purposes, climate changes are permanent and irreversible. But the worst ramifications are what we call nonlinear changes or tipping points. And there are 3 biggies here. One is the melting permafrost, both in the oceans and on the land, and releasing methane, which is another potent greenhouse gas. The complete melt of the Greenland ice sheet, which would raise sea levels about 23 feet, and the melting in Antarctica, which would raise sea levels another 200 feet. Now, Antarctica, people say would take, the melting, if that starts, would take thousands of years. So these aren't things that are going to happen suddenly, but they're things that we have to be concerned about, because once you pass a tipping point, you don't have control of those processes anymore. So I was writing this book, and I was looking at this graph. This was a graph that was really important in my work. It was a graph that came out by the World Bank, I think, in 2013. And here's a simplified form of it. And I had this graph in front of me for weeks while I was writing the book, maybe even months. And it really, really depressed me because I was focusing, well, let's just talk about it a little bit. The vertical axis there talks about the temperature, and here you see we're starting at 0, and we go up to 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees centigrade, and we have the line of business as usual increases going up to around 4 degrees. That's kind of an average level for the models by the year 2100. And I kept focusing on that line and thinking, what in the heck are we going to do? You know, Ellie could still be alive. Ellie would be an 88-year-old person at that point. How is she going to live in a 4-degree world, a world that on average is over 7 degrees, on average hotter than it is now? The thing is that I didn't look at the bottom 2 lines very much. The very lowest line, the one that goes up and that actually starts to decrease in average temperature, is what would happen if we stopped greenhouse gas emissions now. If tomorrow we woke up and someone had taken over the world and said, we will not burn fossil fuels anymore starting today, we would actually have, by 2100, the temperature and the climate going back to a stable stability. And then the middle line right there, the one between those two, is what would happen if we took climate change seriously, and if we did everything that we could. And what that World Bank report said is that this middle line, which keeps us below an increase of 2 degrees centigrade, that's considered the maximum safe temperature. Scientists say if we can stay below 2 degrees centigrade, we're not going to melt Greenland. We don't know if that's exactly true, but that's the approximate line. If we could stay below that now, it's both technically and economically feasible. It's not a matter of being able to do it, it's just a matter of political will. And it took me weeks to realize that this graph is actually a very hopeful graph, because we are still down here. We still have options. We can still determine the future climate of the Earth. And what I realized when I realized that is that everything that I do, my daily actions, shape the climate future, not just of little Ellie, but of our other 5 grandchildren, her siblings and her cousins, and the future of billions of other children on the Earth. Everything that we do either nudges those fossil fuel emissions and climate change temperatures up a little bit or down a little bit. And all of those actions also determine the future for millions of other species. So the question now is, how do we do it? How do we get there? What we have to aim for is a world where we don't keep pumping carbon dioxide into the air. It's pretty straightforward. That's called a carbon neutral world. And I'm going to go through this pretty fast because this is supposed to be a summary. The main thing that we have to do is get rid of fossil fuels. That's very obvious. It's something that we're going to do. It's because we have to do it. It's not a matter of if we do it, it's a matter of when. And the truth is that the faster we do it, the better the results will be, the cheaper they will be, and the simpler the solutions will be. So if you think about it that way, it's kind of a no-brainer to get going quickly rather than waiting. How do we do this? Well, the models say that what we need to do is make reductions, major reductions in fossil fuels within the next decade, maybe 2 decades, major reductions, and then phase them out completely by about 2090, certainly by 2100. Okay, so it doesn't sound so impossible if we look at it that way. Ways that we would get there, one thing is that we have to keep a lot of the fossil fuels in the ground. That's not what the oil companies want to do, but we have to agree not to burn them. And that means we don't do extreme measures like fracking and stuff to get them out of the ground, because what we're trying to do now is to keep them in the ground rather than bring them out and burn them. And we need to have some sort of a carbon pricing system. Pretty much everyone says this, a carbon tax or a cap and trade situation where finances would limit the amount of fossil fuels we would burn. And at the same time, we would need to take the fossil fuel subsidies and maybe we would shift these over to renewable energies, clean energy sources. Iowa is an excellent example for a state that has increased. We have, I think, 28% of our energy coming from wind power now. That's because of both federal and state incentives. It's one of our, I think, shining stars in the state here. And this has provided thousands of jobs, and it's also brought companies like Google and Facebook to Iowa, because a lot of companies now don't want to be labeled as polluters. They want to be able to say, we use green energy. So they've come to Iowa so they could use wind power. It's pretty neat. Energy conservation is a big, important thing that we need to do. Use less at the same time that we switch to green energy. We need new technologies and research. Government policies, obviously, President Obama is really trying to do what he can with these. And international agreements such as the Paris talks that went on this last December and formed new policies for the international community. And then we need personal change, personal action. And this is what I want to talk about for most of the remaining talk, because this is where we come in. Remember that I said that fossil fuels, everything we do where we use fossil fuels makes climate change worse, which is a very depressing way to look at it. But if you turn it around and say everything that we do to be aware of our fossil fuel use and reduce it makes climate change better, it becomes a kind of a hopeful incentive. So I'd like to suggest some ways to get there. But first I want to give just 3 quick examples of the bigger scene, of bigger research that people are doing. And one is something called the Solution Projects that's coming out of Stanford University. A group of researchers, engineers there have designed a system, a plan, whereby every state in the union could become completely free of fossil fuel use by the year 2050, if not before. And their plans point out that this is indeed possible. It's not that we aren't able to do it, it's that we're not doing it. Iowa, according to them, would be about 2/3 wind power and 1/3 solar power, and would also have a lot of reduction, conservation. I think we'd have 30% decrease in conservation, in consumption of energy. And they've calculated how many thousands of jobs we would have created by this, and how much people would actually save in energy costs by the year 2050 if we went to this system. You can go, if you just Google the Solutions Project, it's a pretty neat thing. British Columbia has something called a revenue-neutral carbon tax. That means that all of the tax money that's collected by taxes on carbon doesn't go into the government. Instead, it goes back to the people to stimulate the economy. And British Columbia has done this very successfully. Actually, in Canada, if you look, you can see that between 2000 and 2012, Canada's fossil fuel use has gone up, while British Columbia's fossil fuel use has gone down fairly significantly. And at the same time, their economy has been stimulated. Their economy has actually improved. And my last example, and this just about a week ago, in the New York Times, that was an editorial examining this British Columbia revenue-neutral carbon tax. And it said a carbon tax is the most efficient, market-friendly instrument available in the fight against climate change. So this is something that people are looking at and hopefully will emulate. And then the third thing is something that our oldest son, that cute little blonde-haired boy you saw in the earlier thing, is now a father. He's Ellie's father, living in Switzerland. And he is working as a research scientist at a laboratory on the plan that Switzerland has. This is government policy, that Switzerland will be carbon neutral by the year 2100. Actually, I think it's by 2050. I made a mistake there. And Chris is here standing in front of a model power plant that they have. You may know that one of the problems with green energy is that solar energy is only good when the sun's out. Wind energy is only good when the wind blows. But this is a power plant for a village in Switzerland that uses wind power, solar power, and also biomass, and it switches back and forth among the three depending on the environmental conditions. So they're trying to develop these plants and develop them for every little village in Switzerland. So people are doing exciting things, and this is something that gives me energy and makes me hopeful about climate change. But let's look a little bit at personal change, what individuals, families, and communities can do. And here's another picture of energy. And Ellie is a very energetic little girl, so she's here to give us positive energy. So one thing that I think we need to do is to keep learning, because knowledge is empowering, and if we learn more about climate change, the more we learn, the more we'll be able to figure out what we can do. There's a lot of good information on the web. The thing I'd caution you about is it's very interesting, because if you Google a certain topic, you will always get, you probably will also get information by what are called climate skeptics or climate deniers, and sometimes it's kind of hard to tell the difference. But in my book, I've given some suggestions on how to pick out good information sources. I think we need to talk with others. I think we need to create a buzz about climate change. The other day, I was in a meeting, and I'm not always really, I'm trying to learn how to do this tactfully. Let me just say that. I was in a meeting, and it was really hot out. I mean, I was sweating. You know, this was in March, late February, March, and somebody said, "Isn't this beautiful weather?" And I said, "Well, not if you consider that it's climate change." And the person said, "Oh, is this climate change?" And I said, "Well, you know," I gave them a few statistics. You know, it was kind of obnoxious, but at the same time, I think people don't realize, and we are so adaptable. We like the warm weather. So we think, well, this is great to have nice warm weather in February or January, not realizing that if it's 30 degrees above the norm, then when you get to summer and it's 80 degrees or 90 degrees, we have 110 or 120 degree days, temperatures that are too hot for some to safely go outside at all. So, you know, maybe just talking with people. I read recently that a lot of middle school teachers are now covering climate change in their classes, but that fewer than half of them realize that climate change is caused by human activity, is caused by fossil fuel burning. And so they teach both sides of the issue. You know, they teach, well, it could be caused by, I don't know, you know, we're not going into the ice age, or the earth is tilting, or solar flares or something like that, or it could be caused by burning of fossil fuels. And so if you have middle school kids, talk to the teachers. Say, well, what do you teach them, and what do you know about climate change? You don't have to be obnoxious like I tend to be sometimes. You can talk to them and just be a source of information. I think we have to adjust our mindset, but not too much. And what I mean by that is that we have to learn to accept change. And this is something really hard for me. As I get older, I think about retirement and sitting in a chair and reading novels. And with the world changing this rapidly, I think, well, how can I quit when climate change is changing our world so quickly and our environment is at so much risk? Change is not comfortable for me. I don't like change. But I think that if we say, well, we can't pick if we're going to have change or not, because we're already in the middle of it. But if we get in there, we have the ability to shape that change. And if we ignore the change, if we ignore climate change, it means that it shapes our lives instead of us shaping that process. So the big thing is that we need to be advocates for climate change activity. And especially with our political system, we need to contact legislators and tell them what we think about climate change. If we think it's important, if we think it's worth it to have a carbon tax of some sort. And also businesses. A lot of businesses now are being very active in terms of their climate change policies. A lot of businesses, several that I know of, are working toward carbon neutrality. So if you see that that's happening, tell them you like it. Give them kudos for that. And then we need to act. We need to reduce fossil fuel use personally and within communities. That not only reshapes the future in a more positive way, but it also fights our own despondency. And then if you look at the opposite also, you can think that if we don't act, if we tend to forget about climate change or ignore it, It's really a vote for that climate change taking our world in completely different directions. So what exactly do you do? There are lots of books and websites that can tell you, but one thing that I'd like to mention is if you haven't ever taken your carbon footprint, this is a good thing to do. There are a lot of sites on the web where you can calculate your carbon footprint. This is one that I liked because it was a little bit more complex. It still only takes about 5 or 10 minutes to go through. If you search for Carbon Footprint Limited, and if you do this, you'll find out where you emit most, where you're responsible for most of the carbon dioxide emissions. And if you're like my husband and myself, it mostly comes in through transportation. If you fly a lot, if you fly at all, that's going to be where most of your carbon is emitted. So one thing that you can do if you're still going to fly and visit your grandkids, which we do sometimes, I hate to say it giving this talk, but it's true, is you can do something called buy carbon credits. And these are essentially donations that you make to projects that pull the carbon back out of the air. They might be wind power plants in third world countries, solar power plants. They might be systems for recapturing methane. This is a good site that I found for that. It's run by the United Nations. And if you search for United Nations, Go Carbon Neutral Now, you'll find this site, and you will have the ability to choose dozens of sites where you can contribute money and kind of pay off for the carbon that you're emitting. I'm not recommending this instead of reducing your carbon, but maybe do some of each. So one more thing that I think about people here, as we talked about before, are involved with getting people on the land and restoring the land. And I think that this is a sacred task. I think that this is something that's very, very, very important to do. In a way, it's like preparing our ecosystems for the future, getting them in good shape so they will be as resilient as possible if and when climate change gets a lot worse. Another thing that I think we can do, and I know there are environmental educators in this room, is to tell stories and create visions. We might not realize this, but our generation has grown up knowing about the integrity of the natural world. That's not necessarily true for Ellie and for the kids that follow. And we need to somehow strengthen the collective memory of what a healthy, functioning Earth is like. Tell stories. I wrote a book, but you can just tell your grandkids stories about things that they can do to improve the world so that it works well, so that those ecosystem services keep functioning and keep the Earth healthy. And then the last thing that I put down in my list in the book was to make climate change a priority. And so I sat at the computer. I was typing when I was preparing this PowerPoint. I was typing in the list of things that I recommended, and I said, make climate change a priority. And then I thought, well, what the heck did I mean by that? Because what I've realized is that climate change is the most human thing. The most human response we have is to ignore it, to push it aside, to say we'll do it tomorrow, to say we'll let other people do it, even to say it doesn't exist. Because who wants to be looking at the thing that's been called the greatest crisis, the greatest problem that civilization has ever faced? And that's what we're looking at now, because climate change doesn't leave anybody out. It's not like a problem that's located in the Middle East or in the Arctic or any place elsewhere. It's global. It's a global problem. It's going to affect everybody and everything and all future forms of life and all future people. So why the heck do you want to look at it? Why would you want to get involved in it? When I was writing the book, I really had a hard time with it many times, because it's a very upsetting subject. I went through periods of depression. I went to a counselor. I had to put it aside. I couldn't sleep at night Because when you write about something, it's kind of like making it your bedfellow. You have to think about it night and day, you have to dream about it, and it was just too much for me. I would not wish that on any single person in that room, believe me. That's not what I'm suggesting by making climate change a priority. But I think that the opposite is something that we can't do. We can't just say, well, we're going to leave it for the legislators. We're going to leave it for Google and Facebook and Walmart that are having good, climate change programs. We have to do our little bit because, as I said before, everything that we do takes it in one direction or the other. And I think that one way of doing this, I'm going to read just one short paragraph from the book, is a way of maybe rephrasing climate change, thinking of it in different terms. And this is near the conclusion. How can we come to see climate change as a challenge that creates new possibilities rather than as a crisis that elicits fear? How can we accept climate change mitigation and adaptation as a method for stimulating creativity and our economy, even as it builds environmental health and a robust future? As a mechanism for uniting humanity around a common goal, as a venue for expressing our commitment to future generations, an opportunity, not an indictment. The energizing challenge of a lifetime, our historic moment, our finest hour. And I think that if we want to attack climate change and get on top of it, that's what we need to do with it. We need to get our Manhattan Project together and focus it on climate change, not on the development of nuclear bombs. And we all need to be involved in that. So I'd encourage each of you to do what you can. I remember when Emerald Horizon came out, I would give the talks, and then somebody inevitably would raise his or her hand and say, I live in a little apartment, there's nothing I can do to restore the land. And I'd say, well, do you have a window box? Oh yeah, I've got, just a small vegetable garden or something outside. And I'd say, okay, buy one native plant and watch it. See what insects come to it. See how it spreads. See how it does when there's too much moisture or too little moisture. And you will start falling in love with native plants. And once you've fallen in love with those plants, you'll plant more. That's all it takes. And so I guess that's what I'm encouraging you to do when I say make climate change a priority. Pick out something that you can do, something that's doable. Start it. See how that involves you in action and the sense that you are doing something positive for the things that you love the most, whether those are plants and animals, grandchildren, whatever. And to help you along that way, we do have some climate change tables in the back here. On the way out, I'd like to invite you to visit these tables. These are groups that are involved with doing positive things for climate change in Iowa City. And I'd like to close with Ellie, our little 3-year-old granddaughter, who's actually kind of a handful. She's full of energy. She's always trying to kill herself. And she's always asking questions. And the question that I dread the most is her, in 10 or 20 years, if I'm still alive, saying to me, Oma, you knew what was going on. Why didn't you do something about it? That's the question I never want to have to answer. So I'm going to let her, at age 3, have the last say, as she likes to do. And here's little Ellie saying, thanks for coming, safe travels home, and it's time to get moving on climate change. Thank you.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.